On December 26, 1900, a supply ship approached a lonely lighthouse on a remote group of islands off the coast of Scotland. The crew expected a routine delivery, but something was terribly wrong. The lighthouse lamp, which should have been burning brightly, was dark. When the ship finally arrived at the island, they discovered something even more unsettling. The lighthouse door was closed. The beds were unmade. Food sat untouched on the table, and the 3 men responsible for maintaining the lighthouse were gone. No bodies, no boat, no sign of struggle. This case would become one of the most stunning mysteries of the 20th century. This is the story of the lighthouse keepers of the Flannan Isles.
Hello, I'm Ellie Calderwin.
Far out in the cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean, nearly 20 miles west of the Scottish mainland, lies a small and lonely chain of rocky islands known as the Flannan Isles. From a distance, the islands appear almost barren. Jagged cliffs rise abruptly from the sea, their dark rock faces carved by centuries of relentless wind and crashing waves. There are no harbours here, no villages, no signs of human life, only steep slopes of rough grass and the constant cry of seabirds circling overhead. The Atlantic Ocean surrounding the islands is powerful and unpredictable. In winter, violent storms sweep across the ocean with little warning, sending enormous waves crashing against the cliffs below. On stormy nights, the sound of the sea can be heard for miles, a deep, thunderous roar echoing across the empty islands. For centuries, sailors feared these waters, as the reefs and hidden rocks claimed countless ships. Navigating these dangerous seas in darkness or heavy fog was especially perilous. To help guide vessels safely through the night, lighthouse beacons were built along the coast to warn sailors of the dangers below. In 1899, the Northern Lighthouse Board constructed a new lighthouse on the largest of the Flannan Isles, an island called Eilean Mòr, rising nearly 75 feet above the cliffs. The lighthouse stood like a solitary sentinel facing the Atlantic. Each night, its powerful lamp cast a beam across the dark waters, helping ships navigate safely past the treacherous coastline. That maintaining the lighthouse required men willing to live in one of the most isolated places in Scotland. The lighthouse keepers stationed there worked long shifts, maintaining the light, recording weather conditions, and ensuring the beacon never failed. For weeks at a time, they lived completely cut off from the outside world. No visitors, no passing ships, no contact with the mainland, except the occasional supply boat. Their days were governed by routine, their nights by the steady rotation of the lighthouse beam, and their only constant companions were the wind, the waves, and the endless roar of the Atlantic crashing against the cliffs below. It was a lonely existence, but the men who worked there understood the responsibility of their task, because out on those dangerous waters, the lighthouse was often the only thing standing between a ship and disaster. But in the winter of 1900, that lonely lighthouse would become the center of one of the strangest maritime mysteries ever recorded. In December of 1900, 3 experienced lighthouse keepers were stationed on the island. The principal keeper was James Ducat, a veteran lighthouseman who had spent years working along the dangerous Scottish coast. Quiet and disciplined, Ducat was responsible for the overall operation of the station. Working under him was Thomas Marshall, the second assistant keeper. Marshall had also served in several lighthouse postings and was known for carefully recording weather conditions and maintaining the equipment. The third man in the lighthouse was Donald McArthur, a temporary replacement keeper who had been sent to fill in for another worker. McArthur was different from the other two. He was known among fellow keepers as strong-willed and occasionally hot-tempered. But despite his reputation, he had experience working in harsh coastal environments and understood the demanding conditions of lighthouse life. Together, the three men formed the small team responsible for maintaining the light on Eilean Mòr. Life inside the lighthouse followed a strict routine. Each evening, the keepers prepared the powerful lamp that shone across the Atlantic. They cleaned the glass lenses, trimmed the wicks, and ensured the fuel supply was sufficient to keep the light burning through the long winter nights. Throughout the day, they recorded weather observations in the station logbook. Wind speed, wave height, visibility. These records were vital for maritime authorities monitoring conditions along the coast. Between their duties, the men cooked meals together, read newspapers or books brought from the mainland, and watched the endless movement of the sea from the lighthouse windows. It was quiet work, predictable work, and for experienced lighthouse keepers, the isolation was simply part of the job. But sometime during the second week of December 1900, something happened on the island, something so strange that it would transform the lonely lighthouse on Eilean Mòr into the centre of one of the most enduring mysteries in maritime history. Because within days, all three men would vanish, without a trace. On December 15th, 1900, a merchant vessel known as the SS Arctur was making its way through the dangerous seas near the Flannan Isles. Hidden reefs and powerful currents made the area especially treacherous, particularly during winter storms. On nights like this, ships relied heavily on the lighthouse at Eilean Mòr. Its powerful beam normally swept across the ocean, flashing steadily through the darkness and warning sailors of the cliffs and rocks below. But as the crew of the SS Arctur scanned the horizon that evening, they noticed something strange. The lighthouse was dark. No beam cut through the night. No guiding light appeared over the waves. At first, the sailors assumed the storm clouds had simply hidden the light from view. But as the ship drew closer to the islands, the truth became impossible to ignore. The lighthouse lamp was not burning. For experienced sailors like the crew of SS Arctur, this was deeply unsettling. A lighthouse failing to shine was rare and dangerous. But the Atlantic storms had been fierce that week. Powerful winds and massive waves had been sweeping across the region for days, making it impossible for ships to safely approach the rocky island. So the SS Arctur continued on its course, and for the moment, the dark lighthouse remained an unanswered mystery. It would be several more days before anyone could reach the island and discover what had truly happened there. More than 10 days after the SS Arctur passed by the lighthouse, on December 26, 1900, the lighthouse supply ship Hesperus approached the remote island of Eilean Mòr. The Hesperus was responsible for delivering supplies and rotating lighthouse keepers stationed on the islands. On board that day was a relief keeper named Joseph Moore, who had been assigned to replace one of the men working at the lighthouse. As the ship slowly drew closer to the island, Moore stood on the deck, scanning the cliffs ahead. Normally, lighthouse keepers kept a careful watch for supply ships. When a vessel approached, they would appear at the landing platform to greet the crew and prepare the crane used to lift supplies from the boat. But that morning, the island looked completely deserted. No figures could be seen moving along the cliffs. No one waited near the landing area.
Even more unsettling, no signal flag had been raised from the lighthouse tower to acknowledge the ship's arrival.
The crew of the Hesperus tried sounding the ship's horn. Its deep echo rolled across the cliffs, but there was no response. Eventually, Joseph Mòr volunteered to go ashore and investigate. A small boat carried him toward the rocky landing platform at the base of the cliffs. From there, he began climbing the steep, winding path that led up toward the lighthouse. The wind blew hard across the island, carrying the smell of salt and sea spray. But aside from the wind, the island was silent. No voices, no movement, no sign of the 3 lighthouse keepers who should have been there to greet him. As Mòr reached the top of the path and approached the lighthouse building, an uneasy feeling settled over him. Something about the island felt wrong. The door to the lighthouse stood closed, but the place felt strangely abandoned. As Joseph Mòr reached out to open the door, he had no way of knowing that he was about to step into one of the most baffling maritime mysteries in history. Inside, everything was eerily quiet. The kitchen table was still set. Food sat untouched. A clock had stopped ticking. The oil lamps had been cleaned and prepared for use. But there were no men. The beds in the sleeping quarters had been left unmade. One set of oilskin rain gear was missing from its hook, but the other 2 remained hanging on the wall, which meant at least one of the keepers had gone outside without protective clothing, something experienced lighthouse keepers would rarely do in violent weather. Mòr searched the entire lighthouse, then the island, but the 3 men, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald McArthur, were nowhere to be found. Authorities quickly launched an investigation. The Northern Lighthouse Board sent one of its most experienced officials to inspect the island. His name was Robert Muirhead, a superintendent who had overseen many lighthouse stations along the Scottish coast. Muirhead arrived on Eilean Mòr determined to understand what had happened to the 3 missing keepers. He began by carefully examining the lighthouse itself. Inside, everything appeared strangely normal. The lamp had been cleaned and prepared for use. The living quarters showed no signs of violence. Furniture had not been overturned. There were no broken objects, no evidence of a struggle, nothing to suggest that the men had been attacked or had fought among themselves. Yet the lighthouse was empty. Muirhead then turned his attention to the outside of the island. He walked the steep paths surrounding the station, examining the rocky cliffs where the keepers had worked during storms. Eventually, he reached the western landing platform, the area where supplies were normally brought ashore from visiting ships. What he found there was startling. The landing platform had clearly been battered by the sea. A large crane used to lift equipment from supply boats had been violently twisted from its original position. Heavy iron railings that should have been firmly anchored into the rock were bent and distorted. Even more remarkable, a large wooden supply box had been smashed apart and scattered across the rocks, nearly 100 feet above sea level. For waves to reach that height, the ocean must have been extraordinarily violent. It was clear that immense Atlantic swells had crashed against the cliffs with tremendous force. To Muirhead, the scene suggested that the lighthouse keepers may have gone down to the landing platform to secure equipment during the storm. Perhaps they had been caught by a sudden surge of water, a powerful rogue wave crashing over the rocks. But even this explanation left troubling questions unanswered. The lighthouse protocol required that one man always remain inside the station,
Yet all 3 keepers had vanished, and the sea had left no trace of what happened to them. Inside the lighthouse, investigators examined the keeper's logbook. The entries written just days before the disappearance were unsettling. One entry described a violent storm, unlike anything the keepers had ever seen. Another entry claimed one of the men had been crying, which was highly unusual for experienced lighthouse keepers. The final entry read simply, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all." And after that, nothing. Over the years, many theories have been proposed to explain the disappearance. The most widely accepted explanation is that the men were swept away by a massive wave. Perhaps they had gone outside to secure equipment during the storm. A rogue wave could have struck the cliffs without warning. But there is a problem with that theory. Why would all 3 men leave the lighthouse at the same time? Lighthouse protocol required that one keeper always remain inside. Other theories are far stranger. Some believe the men may have fought with one another. Others claim they were carried away by supernatural forces. Local fishermen once believed the islands were inhabited by spirits. Legends spoke of strange presences moving among the cliffs at night. A few even wonder whether something more deliberate occurred on that lonely island, something that was never fully uncovered. More than a century has passed since the 3 lighthouse keepers vanished from Eilean Mòr. Despite the investigation that followed, no bodies were ever recovered from the sea below the cliffs. No personal belongings were found washed ashore, and no witness ever reported seeing the men leave the island. Official reports from the Northern Lighthouse Board eventually concluded that the most likely explanation was a tragic accident. Today, the lighthouse still stands on Eilean Mòr, watching over the same restless waters. Ships continue to pass through the area, just as they did in 1900. But the fate of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald McArthur was never definitively solved. 3 experienced lighthouse keepers walked out into the storm, and somehow all 3 disappeared, leaving behind an empty lighthouse and one of the most haunting, unsolved disappearances in maritime history. Thank you for listening to another episode of Eerie Stories. I am Ellie Calderwin.